The chamber was sealed for a reason. Not to preserve what was inside, to protect what was outside from it. Deep beneath the palace of Pharaoh, in a room no servant entered, no scribe recorded, no historian was ever permitted to describe something paced. It did not have a body in the way you understand bodies, but it occupied space. It bent light. It left cold wherever it passed. The priests who served it did not call it by name in public. They called it the council. They called it the deep instruction. They offered it blood at midnight and received, in return, the knowledge of how to hold absolute power over men. That knowledge built the most enduring empire the ancient world had ever seen. And then in the space of approximately 9 months that empire shattered. Everyone knows the story. Or thinks they do. A man raised in a palace returns from 40 years in a desert, carrying a wooden staff. He stands before the most powerful ruler on earth and speaks a single demand. The ruler refuses. And then one by one the sky turns wrong. The water turns wrong. The ground turns wrong. The darkness arrives and refuses to leave. What the official story never tells you is what was actually being destroyed. Not the economy of Egypt. Not the political authority of Pharaoh. What was being systematically dismantled judgment by judgment, plague by plague, was an entire invisible architecture that had been constructed over centuries by something that was not human. Ancient texts the church removed before you were born describe what really happened during the Exodus. And the reason they were removed will make complete sense by the time we're done. The version of the Exodus most people know was edited. Not slightly adjusted. Not mildly simplified for a general audience. Surgically stripped of an entire dimension. The books that did not make the final canon, the ones scholars classify as the Apocrypha, the ones that were voted out of scripture at councils held by powerful men in comfortable rooms, those books contain a completely different account of what happened in Egypt. The most critical of these texts is the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is not fringe mythology. It is not recent invention. Fragments of it were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was considered sacred scripture by the community at Qumran. It was and still is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuously practicing Christian communities on earth. The Ethiopian Church kept it. The Western Church threw it away. Ask yourself why. Chapter 48 of the Book of Jubilees describes the Exodus in language that the translators assembling the modern Bible were never going to include in a text intended for mass consumption. According to Jubilees 48, a being named Prince Mastema did not simply observe the events unfolding in Egypt. Prince Mastema orchestrated the resistance. He is described in Jubilees as the chief of the spirits, a fallen entity of enormous power and ancient authority. He is not a minor character. He is not a footnote. In Jubilees, he is the force that hardened pharaohs will beyond all reason. He is the intelligence behind the court magician's ability to replicate the first signs Moses performed. He is the reason that confrontation was not over in a single afternoon. The translators and editors who assembled the canonical Bible across centuries of political maneuvering were building a theology. not preserving a history. And that theology had no room for what Jubilees was saying. Because what Jubilees was saying is this: the Exodus was not a human political rebellion against a human tyrant. It was a cosmic eviction notice, served by one force upon another, with humanity caught in the middle. When you strip out that layer, when you remove Prince Mastema, when you remove the cosmic dimension, you get a story that is easy to control. A story about obedience and freedom. A story about national liberation. A story that powerful institutions can use to inspire loyalty without inspiring too much independent questioning. What you lose is the actual meaning. What that meaning actually contains, and why the people who preserved it thought it was worth burying in desert caves, requires going somewhere unexpected. A desert. 40 years before the confrontation. To a man who was not hiding. Moses was in a desert. Not hiding. Training. This is one of the most systematically misunderstood elements of the Exodus account. The 40 years Moses spent in the wilderness of Midian are consistently presented as a period of exile, a fugitive's life, a man running from the consequences of killing an Egyptian overseer. That is the surface reading. The deeper reading requires understanding who Jethro was. Jethro, called Ruel in some manuscripts, called the priest of Midian throughout the Exodus account, was not a simple desert shepherd. His designation, priest of Midian, in the original Hebrew text, Cohen Midian, marks him as the supreme spiritual authority of that entire region. He was the keeper of ancient traditions that were already old when Moses arrived at his well. Traditions that trace their lineage back through priestly succession lines to the pre-flood world. Scholars who study the parallels between Exodus and older Semitic priestly texts note something consistent. The Midianite tradition preserved knowledge systems passed through priestly succession for generations. Since the time of Shem, Noah's son. In some traditions, all the way back to Enoch himself. Enoch, the figure who walked with the divine and was taken. The figure whose book was banned from the Bible. The figure whose records of the fallen watchers and their forbidden transmissions formed the foundation of the entire framework the Book of Jubilees was written within. The knowledge did not disappear when the flood came. It was preserved, carried, hidden in plain sight inside legitimate priestly orders in the wilderness margins of the ancient world. And Moses spent 40 years being initiated into it. This is why the burning bush encounter is not Moses' beginning. It is his graduation. When he descended from that mountain, he was not carrying a shepherd's staff anymore. He was carrying an instrument. The staff of Moses appears in multiple ancient traditions with a description that has never been fully explained by conventional scholarship. In Exodus, it is called the staff of God, the Mateh ha-Elohim. The same object used to part the Red Sea, to strike the rock and produce water, to hold aloft during battles that determined the survival of an entire people. The tradition in Exodus Rabbah, one of the ancient Midrashic texts, states that the staff was created at the twilight of the sixth day of creation, that it bore the name of God engraved upon it, that it passed from Adam to Enoch, from Enoch to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham through a chain of transmission that history bent but never broke to Joseph, and eventually to Jethro, who buried it in his garden, and then to Moses. Whether you interpret that tradition literally or symbolically, what it is describing is a technology. Not a technology of metal and wire. A technology of spiritual frequency. This is the framework the forbidden texts are working within. In the worldview of Jubilees, of the Book of Enoch, of the ancient priestly traditions, reality has layers. The material world is the surface. Beneath it is an invisible architecture maintained by frequency, by sacred names, by the binding of spiritual authority. Those who understood how that architecture worked could shape events in the material world by operating at the layer beneath it. The court magicians of Egypt understood this. They had been trained in it for generations. The ancient Egyptian mystery schools were not theater. They were not primitive superstition dressed in gold. They were a sophisticated, internally consistent system of knowledge about the invisible layer of reality and how to manipulate it in the service of those who controlled the Nile Valley's theological infrastructure. And behind that infrastructure, according to Jubilees 48, was Prince Mastema. Not physically present in the throne room. Present in the way an intelligence can be present in a system it has designed. Mastema had, over centuries of incremental influence, constructed something inside Egypt. Not just temples. Not just political power. A frequency architecture, a web of ritual, sacrifice, and spiritual binding that tied the power of the Egyptian pantheon into a coherent system of control. The gods of Egypt were not simply myths to the people who lived beneath them. They were real forces, named and invoked, whose influence was mediated through priest classes trained to maintain the connections. Hapi governed the Nile's flooding cycle, the very mechanism of Egyptian agricultural prosperity. Khnum guarded the source of the river at Elephantine. He was said to shape human children on his potter's wheel at the moment of birth. The deity of creation. The life source of the river itself. Amun-Ra was the supreme solar deity. The legitimizing force behind Pharaoh's divine right to rule. And Pharaoh was not merely a king. He was, in Egyptian theology, the earthly incarnation of Horus, the living bridge between the human and the divine. This was the system Moses walked into. With a staff charged, according to the ancient traditions, with the knowledge of priestly lines that predated Egypt itself. With a frequency the magicians of the court had never encountered. Because what they carried had been given to them by Mastema. And it was old. But what Moses carried was older. And older in the logic of this framework means closer to the source. There is something you need to understand before we go further. The 10 judgments that followed were not random catastrophes. They were not even primarily directed at Pharaoh. They were executions. Each one targeted a specific entity. Each one was designed not merely to inconvenience Egypt but to collapse a specific node in the invisible architecture Mastema had spent centuries building. What you are about to hear is not what was taught in any school. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Set aside everything you think you know about the 10 plagues of Egypt. Set aside the movie scenes. The dramatic frog sequences. The perfectly rendered CGI locust clouds. the image of a Hollywood actor parting the sea with his hair blowing in controlled cinematic wind. What you have been shown is spectacle. What actually happened according to the forbidden texts was surgery. Precise. Systematic. Each judgment calibrated to collapse a specific node in the invisible architecture that Mastema had spent centuries constructing inside the most powerful civilization on Earth. Jubilees calls what follows judgment against the princes, not plagues against a people. Executions of entities that had enslaved a people by occupying the theological positions that gave them power over the material world. Here is the decoded record. The first judgment. The Nile turns to blood. In every conventional reading, this is environmental disaster. The river is contaminated. Fish die. Water becomes unusable. An agricultural economy is disrupted. The Egyptian theological system did not experience it as contamination. It experienced it as the death of a god. The Nile was not just water to Egypt. It was the body of Hapi, the deity of the inundation, the source of fertility, the reason Egypt was not simply an extension of the Sahara. Hapi was depicted in Egyptian sacred art as a figure simultaneously carrying both masculine and feminine attributes, the embodiment of the river's dual nature as nourisher and destroyer. When the Nile turned to blood, the theological system of Egypt read it as a single, devastating signal. Hapi has been struck. And Khnum, the ram-headed deity said to guard the source of the Nile at Elephantine, who shaped human children on his potter's wheel at the moment of birth, was addressed by the same judgment simultaneously. The source of life became death. The court magicians replicated the service phenomenon. Jubilees records this explicitly. They could copy what they saw, but they could not reverse it. This distinction is critical. The frequency Mastema had given them allowed surface replication. It could not address the underlying reality. The binding on Hapi had been struck at a level they had no access to. Their transmission could reach the material layer. It could not reach the layer beneath. They demonstrated their power, and in doing so, they demonstrated their limit. The second and third judgments, frogs and gnats, disrupted the priestly class's ability to maintain the ritual purity that was the foundation of their institutional authority. Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility and childbirth, was addressed. Then the dust itself turned against them. Geb, the god of the earth, was weaponized against his own worshippers. The swarms of gnats filled every space the priests used for sacred ritual, rendering the mechanisms of their authority functionally unusable. The fourth judgment flies, but not everywhere. The region of Goshen, where the Hebrew people lived, was untouched. This is not coincidence. This is targeting. The judgment demonstrated that what Moses carried had discrimination. It could distinguish between the population it was protecting and the system it was dismantling. A natural catastrophe makes no theological distinctions. A judgment from a specific authority does. Every Egyptian observer who understood the theological framework would have understood the implication immediately. This was not nature. This was a ruling. The fifth judgment struck the core of their sacred economy. In Egypt, the bull, specifically the apis bull, was not an agricultural asset. It was a living incarnation of the god Ptah, creator deity and patron of craftsmen, whose authority undergirded the entire system of sacred labor the empire ran on. Sacred bulls were maintained in sanctuaries, attended by dedicated priests, buried in state ceremonies of national significance. Every cattle death in Egypt struck at Ptah. Every animal that fell tore another strand from the invisible web. Then came the sixth judgment. Boils. This was an execution of Imhotep, the god of medicine, and Sekhmet, the goddess with the power to heal or cause disease. The court magicians themselves were covered in boils. They could not stand before Moses during this judgment. Jubilees is specific about this detail. They could not stand. Not because they suddenly lacked physical strength. Because the frequency of what was happening had exceeded the operating range of what Mastema's transmission could address. They were inside the system being dismantled. They had no stable ground to stand on because the ground beneath them was dissolving at the level where their authority was rooted. They were silenced. Not by superior force. By the collapse of the foundation beneath their feet. The seventh judgment, hail and fire mingled together. This judgment came with an advance warning. For the first and only time in the sequence, Pharaoh's servants were given the option to shelter their remaining livestock before the judgment fell. Some complied. Some did not. This is not mercy as a strategy. This is judgment as testimony. The warning transforms what follows from catastrophe into verdict. Those who received the warning and chose to remain in the field had made a decision. The judgment that fell on them fell on their decision, not on their vulnerability. The hail targeted Nut, the goddess whose body formed the canopy of the heavens, whose authority over the sky dome was the theological justification for astronomical knowledge in the Egyptian calendar system. Fire falling from the sky was a demonstration of authority over the domain Nut was said to govern. The sky no longer answered to Egypt. The eighth judgment. Locusts. The insects consumed every plant the hail had not already destroyed. Osiris was the god of vegetation, of agricultural renewal, of the cycle that transformed dead earth into living grain. The entire rhythm of Egyptian civilization, planting, flooding, harvest, surplus, was theologically administered through Osiris. The locust judgment addressed Osiris. The cycle of renewal that had made Egypt prosper for 3,000 years was placed under formal suspension. And everything that had come before it falls into its full context with the ninth judgment. 3 days of darkness so complete that ancient accounts describe it as tangible, palpable. A darkness with weight. A darkness that pressed against human skin like a physical presence. Not a solar eclipse those last minutes, not days. Not a volcanic ash event, those produce a different spectrum of effect. Something else. Jubilees describes this darkness as the binding of the solar deity himself. Amun-Ra. By this point in Egypt's history, his name had absorbed Ra, and before Ra, Atum. He was the supreme deity, the anchor of the entire pantheon. His temples stretched from the delta to the borders of Nubia. His authority was the theological ground beneath Pharaoh's throne. And he was enclosed not killed. Enclosed. 3 days in which the sun existed but did not function. 3 days in which the entire theological architecture that justified Pharaoh's rule was suspended. 3 days in which the supreme deity of the most powerful civilization in the ancient world did not respond to the invocations of his priests. 3 days, Egypt had no functioning god. Not metaphorically. In the logic of their own theological system, the god was bound. And Pharaoh sat in a darkness he could not explain, in a palace designed to amplify the authority of a deity that had apparently ceased to respond. And he felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, what the Hebrew people had felt for 400 years. The complete and total absence of protection. The silence of a system that was supposed to answer and didn't. But there is one moment in this sequence that Jubilees describes with unusual precision. Before any plague began, before the Nile turned red, Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh and his assembled court. Aaron cast down the staff of Moses. It became a serpent. The court magicians, under the authority they had received from Prince Mastema, cast down their own staffs. Those staffs also became serpents. The magicians smiled. Then the serpent of Moses' staff turned and consumed the serpents of the magicians' staffs. Completely. Without remainder. The magicians did not smile after that. What this moment represents, in the framework that Book of Jubilees is working within, is the opening declaration of the cosmic confrontation. The two transmission systems were displayed before witnesses. One system consumed the other. Not overpowered in direct combat. Consumed. The Egyptian frequency did not survive contact with what Moses had brought back from the wilderness of Midian. It never had a chance to. And then, the 10th judgment needs no decoding. The death of the firstborn struck at divine succession itself. Pharaoh was the living Horus, the divine son. His own firstborn was the future Horus. The heir whose existence legitimized the theological dynasty that had run unbroken for millennia. The 10th judgment did not merely kill children. It severed the chain. The thing Prince Mastema had built his entire Egyptian system around, the unbroken line of divine authority from the gods to Pharaoh to heir to dynasty to empire, was cut. Not by a human army. Not by a political revolution. Not by economic collapse. By the staff. And the name it carried. And the older transmission behind the name. Now we need to sit with what this means. Not as mythology. Not as ancient metaphor for general inspiration. As an account of something that actually happened, recorded in texts that were old before the Roman Empire existed, preserved in communities that maintained them as sacred when the institutional powers of the Western world chose to exclude them. What does it mean that the Exodus was a cosmic war rather than a human liberation story? The first thing it means is that the oppression was not incidental. 400 years of slavery in Egypt was not an accident of human cruelty or the unfortunate byproduct of imperial expansion. In the framework of Jubilees, the Hebrew people were enslaved within a system specifically designed to extract human labor for the maintenance of a theological infrastructure built by a non-human intelligence. The pyramids, the temples, the obelisks, The colossal monuments that we look at today with a mixture of admiration and genuine bewilderment, they were not simply expressions of human ambition and organizational capacity. They were components of a frequency architecture, built with the labor of human beings who received nothing in return. Not wages, not dignity, not even a basic recognition that they existed as people rather than instruments. Then look at the next empire: Rome, the Mongol expansion, the Atlantic slave trade, the colonial system that stripped 3 continents of labor and called it civilization. The same structure, different names for the gods, different vocabulary for the divine mandate. The same extraction, the same denial of humanity to the people doing the labor. The Egypt that Jubilees describes did not end at the Red Sea. It is a recurring template. The second thing it means is that the judgments had to be that specific. If the oppression was maintained by a coherent and visible system with identifiable components, then dismantling it required addressing those specific components. A general catastrophe would not have been sufficient. A flood, a famine, a regional earthquake, these events destroy indiscriminately. They collapse the oppressor, and the oppressed with equal efficiency. They do not distinguish between the system and the people trapped inside it. What was required was something that could make that distinction. Something that understood the architecture it was dismantling at a level of precision the architecture itself could not defend against. This is why Goshen is untouched by the flies. This is why Hebrew livestock survive the 5th plague when Egyptian livestock do not. This is why the 3 days of darkness fall over all of Egypt except the specific region where the enslaved people are living. The judgment had discrimination because it came from an intelligence that fully understood the system it was addressing. This is not the behavior of a natural force. It is the behavior of a surgeon working with complete knowledge of the anatomy. There is something the Book of Jubilees records that almost no one has heard, even those who have studied the Exodus carefully. Something about what happened at the Red Sea. Something about what was finally ended when the water returned. And something about why it matters that it wasn't permanent. The third thing it means is about Prince Mastema's role in what came immediately after. Jubilees 48 records that Mastema was present at the Red Sea crossing. When Pharaoh's army pursued the Hebrew people into the passage opened through the water, when the chariot forces rolled onto the dry seabed, Mastema was there. Not as an observer. According to Jubilees, he assisted the Egyptian commanders. He encouraged the pursuit. He strengthened the resolve of those who might otherwise have turned back from the impossible sight of walls of water standing on either side. And then the water returned. And Jubilees records that at this moment, Prince Mastema was bound. Not destroyed. Bound. His authority over the Egyptian system was formally revoked. His capacity to maintain the theological architecture he had constructed was ended by legal adjudication. A formal cosmic verdict entered at the moment the last component of his earthly system was buried under the water. The trial was over. The judgment had been entered. The system was complete in its dismantling. But here's what requires careful attention. The binding of Mastema, as Jubilees describes it, was not permanent. He was restrained. For a time. The texts are careful not to say destroyed, not to say ended, not to say resolved beyond future recurrence. The same intelligence that had constructed the Egyptian system, the same capacity for building invisible architectures of power that extracted from human beings in the name of theological authority, did not cease to exist at the Red Sea. It was restrained. And the history that follows the Exodus account the sequence of empires, ideologies, and theological systems that replicate the same structural logic of divine legitimized extraction in different forms across different centuries raises a question that the Book of Jubilees does not answer, but implies. The fourth thing this story means, if any part of it is accurate, concerns what the people who were freed had to become. The liberation from Egypt was not the conclusion of the story. It was the beginning of a formation. 40 years in the wilderness, the same wilderness where Moses had trained, the same desert margins where Jethro had preserved the ancient priestly knowledge through 3 generations of careful succession. The newly freed people were undergoing a process, not simply organizing into a nation, not simply establishing laws and governance structures, becoming a carrier of a different frequency, something that Mastema could not replicate, could not consume, could not gradually absorb into his system as he had absorbed so many before. Because what Moses had brought out of Midian, what the staff represented, what the transmission from Jethro and through Jethro from the ancient lines represented, was not merely greater power. It was a completely different relationship to power. The Egyptian system was built on accumulation, hierarchy, the extraction of value from human beings whose humanity was legally and theologically denied to make the extraction possible. What was being formed in the wilderness was built on covenant, on the radical theological proposition that the most powerful force in the cosmos was not interested in the accumulation of human labor but in the flourishing of human beings. This is a cosmologically extraordinary claim. It is the claim that made the biblical tradition, for better and worse, through centuries of spectacular failure and occasional moments of genuine faithfulness, structurally different from every system that Mastema had previously succeeded in shaping to his purposes. Not because the people were reliably faithful to it. They were not. Not because the institutions that carried it were consistently trustworthy. Many were not. But because the claim itself was recorded, preserved, transmitted in texts that even when actively suppressed in some places survived in others, carried by communities that maintained it under sustained pressure, including the Ethiopian Christians, who kept the Book of Jubilees when Rome said discard it, including the Qumran community, who buried it in desert caves when the political center of their world collapsed around them, including the scribes and scholars across 20 centuries who kept copying texts in languages their neighbors couldn't read, in communities their neighbors didn't protect, because they understood that the transmission itself was what mattered. There is one final element in the Jubilees account that deserves its own attention. At the moment the water stood in walls on either side of the passage, at the moment the Hebrew people walked on the dry seabed with the entire Egyptian army behind them, Moses lifted his staff, not to part the water. The water was already open by the time he raised it. He raised it to signal the end of the adjudication, to declare formally, in the language of cosmic authority, that the judgment sequence was complete. that every note in the Mastema-built architecture had been addressed. That the people who had been held inside it were released not politically alone, not physically alone, but at the level of the invisible binding that had held them for 400 years. The Egyptian army that entered the passage behind them was not simply a military force pursuing fugitives. In the framework of Jubilees, it was the last operational remnant of Mastema's earthly implementation. When the water returned, when it closed over the chariots and the commanders and the force structure of the most powerful army in the ancient world, what was being buried was not just soldiers. It was the final execution of a system that had run for centuries on the premise that human beings could be owned by a divine order that was not, in fact, divine. And Moses stood on the far shore, staff in hand, and watched it go. Every empire in the ancient world told the same story about itself. The gods chose us. Our authority is divine delegation. To question it is to question heaven. Egypt told that story with unparalleled sophistication and architectural scale. Their priests were educated and disciplined. Their theological system had internal coherence developed over 3,000 years. Their monuments were built to last indefinitely and nearly have. And the system behind all of it was taken apart in 9 months. Not by an opposing army. Not by a political revolution. Not by the slow erosion of economic collapse. By man with a staff. The frequency the staff carried. And the authority behind the frequency, and authority that, according to the forbidden texts, predated Egypt, predated Mastema, predated every system of divine legitimized power the ancient world had ever produced. What the Book of Jubilees insists, and what the canonical Bible, in its edited form, cannot quite say, is that the Exodus was not primarily a story about human agency. It was a story about what happens when the systems human beings are trapped inside get addressed at the level they were actually built. You cannot dismantle a system by arguing with its official theology. You cannot free people from an invisible architecture by attacking only its surface manifestations. You have to reach the layer at which the architecture was constructed. Moses went into the wilderness specifically to learn what that layer was. He came back 40 years later with what he had learned. And the most enduring empire in the ancient world did not survive the confrontation. Now I need to ask you something. Think about this before you answer. There are 2 ways to read this story. The first, this was real. A cosmic war. A being of ancient intelligence had built a system sophisticated enough to run for centuries. A greater authority dismantled it, judgment by judgment. The 10 plagues were executions of a theological infrastructure. The Red Sea was the closing argument of a cosmic trial. And Mastema was not destroyed, just restrained. The second, this is the most sophisticated metaphor humanity ever produced for a recurring experience. The pattern of oppression by a power that claims divine sanction. The emergence of a voice from the margins, from the wilderness, that challenges the system at its foundation. The methodical collapse of the structures that maintain the extraction. And the long, difficult journey of formation that has to follow before anything genuinely new can be built. Both readings arrive at the same place. So tell me in the comments honestly, Which system around you right now claims authority beyond questioning? And is there something older than it? Something that can reach it at the level it was actually constructed? That question has no simple answer. But the people who decided the Book of Jubilees was important enough to bury in desert caves the ones who carried it across continents when Rome said burn it, they believed the answer was not only yes. They believed the older frequency was still transmitting. And if you've made it to the end of this, if the question is still moving in you after everything we've covered, then you belong here. Subscribe to the channel, because there are more chapters they removed, more names they redacted, more of the architecture and more of what dismantled it waiting in the texts they buried. And we're going to decode every single one of them.